this whole war happened because Russia was seeking certain, not security guarantees, but security provisions from Western powers. I think, Russians have never been overly obsessed with territory, but they are obsessed with legal aspects. And now that they have declared the 4 regions as the territory of Russia, I think that they will not accept to stop the conflict at the demarcation lines at the moment. So they will either take whole of Donbas and Zaporozhye by force, or they will demand that Ukraine withdraws from there.
What Alex is pointing out here is something often lost in Western coverage. For Russia, this isn't just about land. It's about legal sovereignty and long-term security. Once those territories were declared part of Russia, the conflict crossed a line that makes compromise extremely unlikely. It's less about expansionism and more about drawing a hard boundary to prevent future encroachment. This is the kind of logic that governs nation-states operating from a position of historical trauma and geopolitical pressure. You don't negotiate on what you now consider your homeland.
I think that the question of security guarantee, I tend to go a little bit with the things that are between the lines but are not said outwardly. Back in January of this year, Keir Starmer went to Kiev and he signed a 100-year partnership agreement with Ukraine. And one of the provisions of that partnership agreement is that Great Britain would take control of Ukraine's ports, airports, and certain parts of the infrastructure, essentially points of entry. So, it's not spelled out why this is important to the British, but I assume that it's important for the same reason why ports of entry are always of strategic importance to geopolitical powers through the futures, is because you can use it for a variety of ways to get in weapons, troops, saboteurs, drugs, biological and chemical agents, and so forth. So at some point a few months ago, I forget exactly who it was. I think it was Ben Wallace, but it might have been somebody else from the British side who was saying that it's imperative that Ukrainians don't allow Russians to take Odessa, and that they don't allow the Russians to the river. By the river, he meant the Dnieper. Right? And so I think that this is, I would even take Ukraine's government out of this discussion because they're almost inconsequential. It seems to me that we're dealing always with the strategy of destabilizing, weakening Russia, imposing a war on Russia, and attempting ultimately a regime change in Moscow. And that what the security guarantees would have to achieve in this case is to keep Ukraine as a beachhead, as a viable beachhead for, future attempts to do the same thing.
It's sobering to hear how these so-called security guarantees may actually function as geopolitical traps. Krainer suggests Ukraine is less a sovereign actor and more a strategic tool, one whose value lies in keeping Russia destabilized indefinitely. That's not diplomacy, that's imperial utility.
How big of a role, in your opinion, is the UK playing in all this? Who calls the shots in the EU right now? Because it seems that the EU and EU and the US are butting heads on what a peace deal would look like.
Well, I don't look at governments and nations necessarily as monoliths. So if you asked me this before Trump came to power, I would say same thing. The United States, UK, they're joined at the hip and they're doing the same thing. But since Trump came to power, obviously we have a differentiation between the two nations' approaches, and I think that the United Kingdom is still completely obsessed with Project Ukraine, and I think that they play the dominant role, which the United States has now distanced itself from. We've seen that at a number of junctures through the conflict, like, for example, in the aftermath no, during the counterattack in 2023 in the summer. You had a moment when the Ukrainian commanders were hesitating to go too far because they felt that they shouldn't go beyond where they can secure their lines against the Russians. Whereas NATO commanders were demanding that they go as far as possible territorially. And so there was
all within, but that's all within Ukrainian territories, just how far
within
past Ukrainian lines. And what you're saying is that NATO was encouraging Ukraine to push further into Russian lines.
Correct. And Ukrainian commanders were reluctant. And the man, I forget the name of the commander, but the guy who was in charge of that. So there was a discussion between the American general who was in charge at Ramstein, I think, and Ben Wallace. And so Ben Wallace was asking him, so if this guy was under your direct subordinate, what would you do? And the guy said, I would fire him straight away.
That moment, where Ben Wallace overrides both Ukrainian and American military command, speaks volumes. It reveals who's really calling the shots. It's not about unity among allies. It's about control. And that raises uncomfortable questions about who Ukraine is actually fighting for.
So the incident that I was talking about was between Ben Wallace. The American commander in Germany was Christopher T. Donahue, and the Ukrainian commander who ended up sacked by Ben Wallace was Major General Andriy Kovalchuk. Now, why the UK? Well, I kind of look at history in the long cycle, and I've noticed that the UK has had a very, very long tradition of rabid Russophobia. I've lived in the UK. I've worked with a lot of British people, and I feel that it's almost like it's in the mother's milk for whatever reason. But it goes back in history to the first Crimea War and farther back as well. If we just go back to World War II, for example, here's what happened. In 1945, the war was drawing to a close, and then the British intelligence drafted this thing called Operation Unthinkable. We know about this, right? The idea was to use the remaining German forces, Polish manpower, British and American troops, to launch a surprise attack on the Soviet Union and to basically destroy it when they weren't expecting it. FDR was still alive, and Dwight Eisenhower thought it was complete madness. But if you read the document, it says, okay, we might succeed if we go very, very fast, like a flash surprise attack, or if not, it's going to have to be a very long project. It doesn't specify how long, but it's implied from the document that what they mean is decades.
That idea, planning in terms of decades, really tells you how power operates. And it also explains why coverage can feel so different depending on where you look. You ever notice how two headlines can describe the same event and yet leave you with completely different impressions? That's not an accident. It's narrative, shaped by media bias. We can't eliminate it, but we can compare how different outlets frame the same story. That's where ground news comes in. It's not a news outlet. It's a tool that shows how major sources across the political spectrum cover the same event. Left, right, and everything in between. Take this story. Putin and U.S. envoys hold 5-hour talks with no territory compromise. Ground news shows that over 400 sources reported on this story and lets you see how factual each source is, which is based on 2 trusted rating systems, Ad Fontes Media and Media Bias Fact Check. Their bias comparison feature gives a very useful summary of the left and right are framing the story. Left-leaning outlets highlight that the talks are not bringing us closer to peace and questions the envoy's legitimacy, saying it's corrupt or unconstitutional, while right-leaning outlets underscore Trump's envoy's involvement and frame Putin as arrogant. Ground news makes it easy for you to compare all sides of the story so you can see the full picture and make your own judgment. If you want the ability to think freely about the news, subscribe using my link ground.news/unfiltered in the description, or scan the QR code on screen to get 40% off the Vantage plan, the same one I'm using. I highly encourage you to do so.
I don't think I don't think that the Russophobia is the core reason. I think that the core reasons are strategic. But I think that the Russophobia, the way I have experienced it among many British people, is flat out racism. But I think that comes downstream from the strategic issues, and strategic issues go back to Macindarian geopolitics, because if you go back to Halford Mackinder's writings between 1904, 1918, 1919, and up to 1940, I think he published his last paper in 1944. The constant is the overarching imperative of the British Empire is to assert hegemony over the Eurasian landmass, right? And then the problem is that Britain is a maritime empire, and the weakness of the maritime empire is that it cannot control the economy's commerce or military of land-based empires.
This distinction between maritime and land-based empires is profound. Britain's fear wasn't irrational, it was strategic. Controlling Eurasia meant controlling the heart of global power. And if you're a sea power watching that emerge on land, your only play is to surround, fragment, and interfere continuously.
And they predicted that a land-based empire would emerge on the continent of Eurasia, basically in what they called at first the pivot area, but then later he renamed it as Heartland. That's Mackinder's Heartland theory. And he assumed that that power would be Russia, that would emerge on the continent. And they were fearing that because they would not be able to control that this empire could grow so strong that eventually it would be able to build maritime fleets much larger and much more powerful than the British ones. So in all that, Mackinder formulates a strategy of preempting this land-based empire. And basically he says that they can surround the pivot area, which is basically geographically, I could tell you, it's a land area stretching from, let's see, the Black Sea towards the Afghanistan in the east, and covering large parts of Siberia and Iran and so forth. And so basically, to keep that empire from emerging, the British saw that they would be able to surround it by a number of beachheads. Mackinder explicitly says this. And at the time, so this was 1904 when he wrote this strategy, he was talking about France, Italy, Egypt, India, and Korea, right? So like an arc of crisis, which we still have today. The geography has changed. Today you could draw that arc of crisis from the Baltic down to the Eastern Mediterranean and then across to the Koreas. Since then, Ukraine became a nation, Israel became a nation, India became divided between Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Korea's got divided, North and South Korea. So these are all flashpoints that can always be detonated to create a potential quagmire war, into which then you draw this pivot power and you constantly weaken it. And then the role of the empire, of the maritime empire, is to supply the armies of these beachheads with weapons, ammunitions, credit, whatever they need to fight that war. And the effect is that they constantly keep this pivot power weakened.
This is the blueprint laid bare, not just for Russia, but for any rising power in the heart of Eurasia. The game isn't about victory anymore. It's about maintaining a permanent state of containment. What's chilling is how consistent the strategy has been for over a century.
And this is exactly what we're seeing today in action. I think that this is the core source of obsession with Russia, with Ukraine, and with all these other flashpoints. And this is why, Britain has separate military cooperation agreements in the Balkans with Poland, with Ukraine, with the Baltic states, Denmark, Sweden, France still, and so forth. And why is Eurasian landmass important? Because that's where the biggest chunk of the population, biggest resource riches, GDP, energy resources, water resources, and so forth. And for the empire, this is collateral. If they don't control it politically, somebody else does. You can't turn it into collateral for your own banking system.
That last point is quietly explosive. At the end of the day, control isn't just about armies. It's about turning the world's real resources into financial leverage. And if a region like Eurasia can't be absorbed into your banking system, it becomes a threat, not economically, but ideologically. This goes beyond borders and into the realm of civilization models, who gets to write the rules and who must obey them. Krainer paints a picture where economics, security, and culture are all just tools in a much older imperial game.